As we pulled up the gravel driveway, the farmhouse looked like something straight out of a storybook. My wife, Emma, and our two kids, Luke and Sophie, were excited for our week-long escape from city life. I was a bit more skeptical. The house, though charming with its ivy-clad stone walls and sprawling front porch, had an old-world quality that made me uneasy. It felt like the place where old memories lingered, only sometimes in the best ways. The first night was calm enough. We unpacked, explored the large, creaky rooms, and set up our things. The kids picked out their rooms, and Emma and I settled into a cozy bedroom at the end of the hall. We tucked the kids into bed, and by 9 p.m. the house was quiet. Emma and I planned to unwind with a bottle of wine and a movie. As we settled on the sofa, the house felt like it was settling too, creaking and groaning under its weight. It wasn't until later that night that things started to feel off. The kids were asleep, and Emma and I were bottomless into our movie when we heard a series of deliberate footsteps coming from the hallway outside our bedroom. I assumed it was the kids wandering around, but the hallway was empty when I checked. Still on the sofa, Emma shrugged it off as the house settled, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Later that night, as I lay in bed, a cold draft swept through the room, making me shiver despite the warmth of the blankets. I sat up, my breath forming little clouds in the chilly air. I assumed it was just the old windows, but then I saw a shadow in the corner of the room. It was a dark, shifting shape that seemed to move with a life of its own. My heart raced, and I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, but the shadow persisted. I reached over to shake Emma awake, but she was fast asleep. I blinked hard, and when I looked back, the shadow was gone. I got up and checked the windows and doors, trying to find a logical explanation for the chill and the dark shape, but everything was as it should be. I returned to bed, though I didn't sleep much that night. The next day, we all went about exploring the nearby fields, visiting the local market, and enjoying the countryside. The farmhouse seemed more welcoming in the daylight, but the strange occurrences returned as night fell. Objects that had been in one place were now in another. Emma noticed it first when she couldn't find the remote control for the TV. We both laughed it off, thinking the kids had misplaced it, but the unease grew as the night wore on. When the kids were in bed again and the house quiet, I sat in the living room, trying to shake off the sense of dread. The shadows in the corners seemed to dance in the flickering light of the fireplace, and every creak of the floorboards sounded amplified. Emma was trying to relax with a book, but even she seemed on edge. It was clear that something was amiss, but neither of us could put our finger on it. As I sat there, the thought that we might have made a mistake in choosing this house began to creep into my mind. The quiet was too still, the shadows too dark. Something about this old farmhouse felt wrong, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Little did I know, this was the beginning of our unsettling stay. When we first arrived, the farmhouse looked like something straight out of a storybook. It was quaint and charming, with its whitewashed walls and overgrown garden giving it a nostalgic feel. We were thrilled about our week-long escape from the city, eager to enjoy the peace of the countryside. The realtor had assured us that the house was cozy and perfect for a family getaway, and it was, at least on the surface. After tucking the kids into their bunk beds and settling them down with their favorite bedtime stories the first night, my wife and I took a moment to unwind. We sat by the fireplace, its crackling warmth contrasting the chilly night air outside. Everything seemed idyllic until we heard it. The noise came from the hallway, a series of slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was pacing back and forth just outside our bedroom door. My wife and I exchanged uneasy glances. We both knew the farmhouse was old and houses had quirks, but this was different. It sounded as though someone was deliberately walking in the hallway. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the house settling or the wind moving things around. But the sound persisted. I got up to check, hoping to reassure my wife that it was nothing to worry about. I crept down the creaky hallway, only to find the hallway empty and still. There were no signs of movement or any logical explanation for the noise. The house was quiet again, and unease settled heavily in my chest. The next night, things took a turn for the stranger. We were all in bed, the kids asleep, when I felt a sudden chill in the room. The temperature had dropped noticeably, even though the fireplace was still substantial. I thought it was a draft, so I checked the windows and doors, but everything seemed in order. It was then that I saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room. It was just a fleeting glimpse, like a wisp of darkness that moved unnaturally against the dimly lit backdrop. I blinked, and it was gone. I brushed it off, attributing it to the dim light and my tired eyes. But the next few nights were no better. Objects began to disappear and reappear in strange places. A book would vanish from the coffee table only to reappear on the kitchen counter. The temperature swings became more extreme, and the cold drafts more pronounced. The unsettling occurrences seemed to escalate each night, making it harder to ignore. The house had a way of whispering to me in the dead of night, with its old floorboards groaning under phantom footsteps. Every little noise seemed amplified in the silence of the farmhouse. It felt as though the house itself was alive, watching and waiting. By the fourth night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I started digging into the farmhouse's history, hoping to find some logical explanation for the strange occurrences. Old records were sparse, but I found a few local legends and rumors about the place. There were whispers of a tragic event involving the previous owners, but the details were vague and muddled. As I sifted through the house's history, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than old stories. Something about the house's atmosphere, the way it seemed to react to us, made me believe that we were not alone. The shadows in the corners, the cold drafts, they felt like messages waiting to be deciphered. The first night in the old farmhouse was meant to be a simple start to our vacation. After the kids were tucked into their beds, my wife and I settled in with a glass of wine, ready to enjoy peace. The house was a mix of charming and eerie, with its creaky floorboards and dim lighting that only seemed to heighten the sense of nostalgia. As we relaxed in the living room, we heard a soft, deliberate series of footsteps echoing from the hallway outside the bedroom. The sound was unmistakable, slow, rhythmic, and heavy. I glanced at my wife, who looked as puzzled as I felt. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes wide. "It sounds like someone's walking around out there." I got up to investigate, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was beginning to settle in my chest. The house was old, so that it could be the buildings settling or pipes making noises. But as I walked towards the bedroom, the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving only an unsettling silence in their wake. I opened the bedroom door slowly, peeking out into the hallway. The house was bathed in the faint light from the moon that filtered through the dusty windows, casting long, creeping shadows along the walls. There was nothing out of the ordinary. The hallway was empty, as quiet as before the footsteps started. I walked back to the living room, trying to act nonchalant. "Must have been the house settling," I said, chuckling. My wife looked at me, not entirely convinced, but willing to take comfort in the explanation. We tried to brush off the incident and went to bed, hoping it was just a figment of our imagination. But as the night progressed, I found myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps had been so clear, so actual. My mind kept replaying the sound over and over, each time amplifying my anxiety. Around midnight, just as I was starting to drift off, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the room. I shivered and pulled the blankets tighter, but the chill was relentless. I glanced around, noticing that the temperature had dropped significantly. The room was freezing, an unusual contrast to the day's warmth. I got up to check the windows and doors, making sure everything was closed tight. As I walked back to the bed, I saw something moving in the corner of the room. A dark shape seemed to flicker and waver before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. My heart raced, and I stood still, straining to see if it would return. Nothing. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. The cold, however, persisted, and sleep became elusive. The footsteps had been one thing, but now there was something more, an unsettling presence that I couldn't quite explain. In the morning, I tried to put the events behind me. I told myself it was just the quirks of an old house. After all, these places can get under your skin, especially when you're alone with your thoughts in the middle of the night. But as I watched my family enjoy the new surroundings, the feeling that something was amiss never left me. The farmhouse was supposed to be a retreat, but something more sinister was already lurking just beyond the surface. The farmhouse which had initially seemed like a perfect retreat, was becoming a source of growing anxiety. What started as a single unsettling event quickly turned into a series of unnerving occurrences that left me and my family on edge. It began on the second night. We had just put the kids to bed and settled into the living room for a quiet evening. My wife Laura was reading a book, and I was lounging on the couch, scrolling through my phone. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old floorboards and the distant chirping of crickets outside. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room plummeted. I glanced at the thermostat. Nothing seemed unusual, but the cold was unmistakable. It was as if someone had opened a window to the freezing night. Laura shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her. "Is it just me, or is it suddenly freezing in here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, checking the windows, but they were all closed tight. I shrugged it off, thinking it might just be the old house settling. As I walked back to the couch, I noticed the draft was gone, but a strange feeling of being watched had settled over me. Later that night, after we'd gone to bed, I was jolted awake by a loud bang. My heart raced as I sat up and listened intently. The sound had come from downstairs, but I found nothing amiss when I ventured out of the bedroom. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I checked the doors and windows, but everything was secure. I returned to bed, but sleep eluded me. The third night was even worse. As I was drifting off, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Not the kind of footsteps that come from someone walking through the house, but slow, deliberate steps, almost as if someone was pacing back and forth. I nudged Laura, but she was deep in sleep. I got up to investigate, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The footsteps seemed to follow me, always just out of sight. I reached the hallway and found nothing, the wooden floorboards eerily still. Feeling unsettled, I returned to bed, but the disturbances didn't stop. Over the next few days, things began to move on their own. The first instance was a kitchen chair that we found pushed out from the table in the morning despite it being tucked in when we went to bed. Then, there were objects in the living room. A book left on the coffee table was now on the floor, and a vase had been shifted from its usual spot. The most unsettling event occurred one evening when Laura and I were in the kitchen. The air turned cold again, and we both noticed a peculiar smell, like damp earth and decay. I tried to dismiss it as something with the old house's plumbing, but the smell seemed to follow us from room to room, growing stronger each time. Every night felt like a battle against our growing fear. My mind raced to explain the events, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Laura was frightened too, but she tried to stay calm for the kids' sake. I woke up at odd hours, checking the house and searching for logical explanations, only to find everything in order. The days were filled with growing unease, and every creak of the old house seemed amplified. It was clear that something was happening, something beyond the normal wear and tear of an old farmhouse. I wondered if something more sinister was at play, something that drafts and old pipes couldn't explain. As the nights wore on, the feeling of dread only deepened. The house, once a charming escape, had become a place of unease, each night bringing a new challenge. The ghostly presence was becoming more than just an annoyance. It was a constant, oppressive force that seemed determined to make its presence known. The tension in the farmhouse was almost palpable, hanging heavy in the air like an unwelcome guest. Each night brought a new wave of eerie phenomena that no one in my family could easily dismiss. The footsteps, the vanishing objects, and the cold drafts were all becoming too unsettling to ignore. Desperate to understand what was happening, I decided to dig into the farmhouse's history. The past may be the key to unraveling the mystery if there was a reason for these disturbances. While my family was still asleep the following morning, I went to the local library. The farmhouse, while quaint, was old, over a century old, according to the listing on Airbnb. I hoped that researching the house's history might uncover something to explain the unsettling events. The library was a quiet sanctuary, filled with the musty scent of old books and the faint rustle of pages turning. I approached the librarian, an older woman with kind eyes and a deep knowledge of the town's history. After explaining my situation and desire to research the farmhouse, she directed me to the local archives section. I spent hours poring over old records, newspapers, and property deeds. The more I read, the more I realized that the farmhouse had seen much history. Built in the late 1800s, it had been owned by several families over the years. Most of the records were mundane: property transfers, tax records, and letters of correspondence, until I stumbled upon a file marked with a red tag, Historical Incident Report. With trembling hands, I opened the file. Inside were clippings from old newspapers detailing a series of tragic events connected to the house. In the 1950s, the farmhouse was home to a family with a young woman who was reported missing under mysterious circumstances. Her name was Alice Harper. The articles were vague, mentioning that she had vanished one night without a trace. The family was devastated, and the case went cold. As I read the articles, I noticed a recurring mention of strange occurrences in the house. Neighbors reported seeing shadows moving in the windows and strange noises at night. These accounts matched the experiences we'd been having. The disturbances in the farmhouse were not a recent phenomenon, but part of a pattern that had persisted for decades. I found a few more details in local history books about Alice Harper. She was described as a kind and gentle soul who had fallen in love with a man from the neighboring town. Their relationship was frowned upon by her family, who had strong objections. The tension between Alice and her family was well documented, culminating in a bitter argument just days before her disappearance. The final information was a letter from a local historian who had investigated the house years ago. The letter mentioned a belief among some townsfolk that the farmhouse was cursed, tied to Alice's unresolved fate. The historian speculated that her spirit might be restless, trapped by unresolved issues and the tragedy that befell her. With this newfound knowledge, I returned to the farmhouse with a heavy heart. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together. It seemed clear that whatever haunted the house was linked to Alice Harper and her tragic story. My next step is to communicate with the spirit directly, hoping to bring her some peace and, in turn, some peace to our disturbed home. The nights in the old farmhouse seemed to grow more unnerving with each passing day. What had started as minor oddities escalated into unsettling phenomena that left me questioning my sanity. I tried to maintain a brave face for my family, but the reality of our situation was impossible to ignore. It began subtly. Small things like the creaking of the floorboards at odd hours, or the sudden chill in the air that would make me shiver despite the thermostat being set comfortably. I told myself it was just the old house settling, or drafts from poorly sealed windows. But then, the disturbances grew more pronounced. One evening, while I was in the kitchen making dinner, I noticed a peculiar draft. The temperature seemed to drop sharply, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I checked the windows, the doors, and the heating system, but everything worked. The draft disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving me unsettled and confused. Later that night, as I tried to relax on the couch, I heard a series of soft thuds coming from the hallway. I went to investigate, but found nothing out of place. The hallway was empty, and the children were asleep in their rooms. I brushed it off, thinking it must have been the house settling or some other harmless explanation. But then the fundamental strangeness began. Objects started to move on their own. At first, it was just minor things. My glasses would be in a different spot than where I left them, or a book would shift on the shelf. I thought it was my forgetfulness, until one morning when I found my keys on the kitchen counter, even though I was sure I'd left them on the entryway table. I noticed other oddities. The temperature in certain rooms would fluctuate wildly, sometimes growing uncomfortably warm and freezing cold within minutes. I could never predict when or where these temperature changes would occur. The sudden shifts in temperature made me feel uneasy, as if something unseen was manipulating the environment around us. The most unsettling occurrence happened one night when I was trying to sleep. I had finally drifted off when I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. Not the distant, vague sounds I'd heard before, but clear, deliberate steps walking up and down the hallway outside our bedroom. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the footsteps growing closer and then retreating, only to come back again. I mustered the courage to get up and check, but once more no one was there. I decided it was time to do some serious investigation. I started keeping a journal, noting every strange occurrence, temperature drop, and unexplained sound. I also set up a few cameras around the house, hoping to capture something that could explain the disturbances. I reviewed the footage religiously, looking for any signs of movement or anomalies. What I saw on the recordings was even more unsettling. The cameras captured brief flashes of movement, shadows that seemed to flicker in and out of existence, strange reflections in the dark, and objects moving on their own. The footage didn't provide any concrete answers, but it was clear that whatever was happening in the house was not easily explained. I began to feel a constant presence, a sense that we were not alone. It wasn't just the creaks and the drafts anymore. It was an almost tangible feeling of being watched. I tried to brush it off, telling myself my nerves were getting the best of me. But deep down, I knew there was something more sinister at play. The final straw came one night, when, after a particularly harrowing day of unexplained noises and moving objects, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft, mournful whisper, my name repeated repeatedly, drifting through the house's darkness. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make out the words. It was as if someone was trying to reach out to me from beyond, pleading for help. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever haunted this farmhouse had escalated from strange coincidences to direct, unsettling encounters. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and the safety of my family was at stake. It was time to confront whatever was lurking in the shadows and find out what it wanted from us. The nights had been increasingly unsettling, and I could no longer ignore the growing dread that settled over the farmhouse. I knew I had to do something after seeing the shadowy figure and experiencing the cold drafts and disappearing objects. My family was also starting to feel the strain, their unease palpable even in the daylight. It was time to take a more direct approach. I needed to contact the spirit and find out what kept it tied to this place. I researched and learned a bit about simple rituals and methods for communicating with spirits. While I didn't believe in the supernatural, I was desperate for answers. The idea of conversing with whatever was haunting us was the only way to find some peace and hopefully end the strange occurrences. I prepared the basement for the ritual. It seemed the most fitting place, remote, away from the bedrooms, and with an air of mystery that matched the gravity of what I was about to attempt. I gathered a few items, a candle, a small bowl of salt, and an old journal I had found in the attic. I also used a flashlight to illuminate the space, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. I set the candle in the center of the room and surrounded it with a circle of salt. I placed the journal next to it, feeling a mix of anticipation and anxiety. I wasn't sure if this would work or even the right thing to do, but I had to try. I took a deep breath and began to speak aloud. "Hello? If there's someone here with us, I'm trying to reach you. We want to understand what's happening. Why are you here?" The room felt colder almost immediately, and the candle flame flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I couldn't help but shiver as I continued. "I know something is troubling you. If you need help, please show us a sign and let us know what we can do." The silence was thick, almost oppressive. I waited, my eyes darting around the dimly lit basement. The air felt charged, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. For a moment, I wondered if I was being foolish, if all of this was just a product of my imagination. But then, a chill swept through the room and I saw it. The shadowy figure I had glimpsed before. It materialized in the corner, a dark silhouette that seemed to waver and shift. The figure appeared to be a woman, her outline indistinct, but her presence was undeniably there. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt fear and compassion. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The shadow didn't speak, but the temperature in the room dropped sharply. I could see my breath misting in the air. The figure moved closer, its form becoming a little clearer. I noticed what looked like an old-fashioned dress and realized with a start that this was no ordinary apparition. "Please," I said, "tell us what you need. We want to help you." The figure seemed to reach out, and I felt a sense of profound sadness for a brief moment. It was as if the room itself was mourning. I could almost hear a faint whisper, but the words were too indistinct to understand. I took out the journal and opened it, hoping the act of writing would help in some way. I wrote down everything I had seen and felt, my hand trembling. The figure hovered nearby, and I could sense a kind of resignation in its presence. After a while, the shadowy figure faded, leaving a lingering chill and a sense of profound melancholy. I blew out the candle and packed the items, feeling drained and hopeful. I knew that I had to continue this process to learn more about the spirit and find out what it needed to move on. But for now, the experience had given me a glimpse into the torment of whatever was haunting this house, and I was determined to help it find peace. The house remained cold and quiet, but I felt a renewed sense of purpose. If contacting the spirit was the first step in solving this mystery, I was ready to take whatever came next. The more I delved into the farmhouse's history, the clearer it became that something tragic had happened here, something that might explain the haunting. After hours spent in old archives and dusty library corners, I finally stumbled upon several newspaper clippings from decades ago. The articles were yellowed and brittle, but told a haunting tale that chilled me. The clippings detailed the life of Eleanor Brooks, a woman who had once lived in the farmhouse with her family. Her life had been marked by hardship and tragedy. According to the articles, Eleanor had moved into the farmhouse with her husband and 2 young children during the early 1950s. They had hoped for a fresh start after several personal and financial setbacks. The first few years seemed promising, but then disaster struck. Eleanor's husband fell ill with a mysterious illness that no doctor could diagnose. His health deteriorated rapidly, and he passed away within a year. The newspapers hinted at local rumors of financial troubles and a possible affair, but nothing was confirmed. Eleanor was left alone to raise her children in the farmhouse. The clippings mentioned that she struggled deeply with grief and financial instability. One article described how Eleanor's once beautiful home had fallen into disrepair as she became more isolated. Her children were eventually taken away by social services due to allegations of neglect, leaving Eleanor to live out her final years in the farmhouse alone. The final and most chilling piece of the puzzle came from a handwritten journal entry I found tucked between the pages of a bound collection. It was Eleanor's diary, which contained a desperate account of her final days in the house. Her writing was fragmented and filled with sorrowful ramblings, but a few passages stood out starkly. "I can't bear the loneliness. The house needs to be more quiet. I keep hearing footsteps, but there's no one there. I see shadows moving where there should be none. I feel trapped, as though something is watching me." As I read those words, the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Eleanor wasn't just lingering because of her death. Her isolation and despair had consumed her. Her suffering had left a deep imprint on the farmhouse, causing her spirit to remain tethered to the place where she had endured so much pain. Determined to set things right, I began preparing for a séance. The journal mentioned Eleanor's longing for release and peace, and I hoped that by acknowledging her pain and offering a way to move on, I might finally end the haunting. I gathered the necessary items, candles, a quiet space, and a few personal mementos of Eleanor's that I had found in the old records. That evening, as I prepared for the ritual, I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. I had read about such rituals, but had never attempted one myself. The atmosphere in the farmhouse was thick with expectation, almost as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I lit the candles and arranged them in a circle in the center of the living room, trying to create a calm, respectful space for Eleanor. As the room darkened and the flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, I called out to Eleanor, speaking gently and respectfully, acknowledging her suffering and asking for her presence. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and a chill ran down my spine. The shadows seemed to dance around the room, and I could sense a presence, though I couldn't see her. I continued to speak softly, urging her to find peace and offering her a chance to leave the confines of the farmhouse. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I could almost hear a faint, mournful cry in the distance. It was as if Eleanor was trying to communicate, to tell me more about her pain. By the end of the séance, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and hope. I believed that Eleanor had heard my words and was finally getting the chance to let go. As I extinguished the candles, I felt a lightness in the air, a sense that the oppressive atmosphere of the farmhouse had lifted slightly. The truth about Eleanor Brooks was a painful revelation, but also a crucial step in addressing the haunting. Now, with a deeper understanding of her tragic past, I hoped the next chapter in this story would bring the resolution that Eleanor and my family desperately needed. The evening had grown colder, the chill seeping through the farmhouse walls despite the roaring fire I had lit in the living room. I had decided that tonight was the night, no more waiting or avoidance. I had gathered everything I needed for the ritual. Candles, a few personal items of mine, a book with instructions I'd found online. I felt a mix of fear and determination, knowing that facing it head-on was the only way to find out what was truly happening. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I prepared the living room for the ritual. I arranged the candles in a circle, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. I placed the personal items, things I thought might help in contacting the spirit, inside the circle. I sat down in the middle, trying to steady my racing heart. The air felt charged, as if the house held its breath in anticipation. I began to recite the words from the book, my voice trembling slightly but growing steadier as I spoke. I had no idea if it would work, if it would even reach the spirit, but I had to try. The room grew colder as I spoke, the fire's warmth fighting a losing battle against the chill. Halfway through the ritual, the temperature dropped sharply. My breath turned into visible puffs of mist. I could feel the presence in the room, a tangible weight that pressed down on me. The shadows around the candles seemed to move, dancing erratically on the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to keep going, determined to make contact. And then, as if in response to my words, a figure began to take shape in the corner of the room. At first, it was just a silhouette, but then details emerged. A woman, her features soft and sad, her eyes hollow with an endless sorrow. She wore a dress from a bygone era, her form shimmering faintly in the candlelight. The sight was both beautiful and heart-wrenching. I tried to stay calm, but seeing her so clearly was overwhelming. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an immediate, profound sadness emanating from her. She began to speak, her voice a whisper that seemed to echo from far away. "Help me," she said, trembling with a centuries-old grief. "I need to tell my story. They took everything from me." I could barely make out the words, but I strained to listen, deeply connected to her plight. The woman revealed that she had lived in this house many years ago during a significant hardship. She had been wronged by those she trusted and betrayed in a way that led to her untimely death. Her spirit had been bound to the farmhouse, unable to move on due to the injustice she had suffered. The more she spoke, the clearer her story became. I learned that she had been a victim of a cruel betrayal. Her family had been taken from her, and she was left to face her end alone, her voice silenced. The house had become a prison for her, a place where she could only relive her pain and longing for justice. As her story unfolded, I could feel her anguish and desperation. It was as if her pain was becoming my own. I knew I had to help her find peace. I promised her that I would do everything I could to bring her story to light and ensure that her suffering was acknowledged. The ritual's energy began to shift, the air feeling lighter as if a weight had been lifted. The woman's form started to fade, her expression shifting from sorrowful to serene. She mouthed, "Thank you," one last time before her figure dissolved completely, leaving the room warm and lighter. I sat in the quiet aftermath, the flickering candlelight casting gentle shadows on the walls. I felt a deep sense of relief, knowing I had done something important that might finally give her peace. But even as I blew out the candles and began to clean up, a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The house was quieter now, but the memory of the night lingered, a haunting reminder of the past that had come to life. The farmhouse was quiet as I set up the final steps of the ritual. The shadows of the old house seemed to hold their breath as if the walls themselves were waiting for what was to come. I had spent the entire day preparing, reviewing old records, and researching the tragic history of the woman who had haunted this place. It was time to confront her and offer her the peace she desperately needed. The candlelight flickered as I arranged my gathered symbols and artifacts, old photographs, letters, and a small mirror. Each item had a significance, a connection to the woman's past and the life she had been denied. The chill in the air was palpable, and I could feel the weight of the house's history pressing down on me. As I began the ritual, I spoke softly, reciting the words I had learned from the old journal I found. The language was ancient and almost musical, with reverence and urgency. I could feel the temperature in the room drop even further, a sure sign that the spirit was near. The moment of truth arrived when the air grew colder, and I saw her a translucent figure appearing in the dim light. She was dressed in a tattered gown, her face a haunting reflection of sorrow and desperation. The ghostly woman looked directly at me, her eyes hollow yet full of unspoken pain. She seemed to float rather than walk, her movements fluid but disconnected from the physical world. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a ghostly echo that sent shivers down my spine. The words were barely audible, yet they resonated with a depth of sadness that was almost unbearable. I could see the desperation in her eyes, the silent plea for release from her torment. I took a deep breath and continued the ritual, following the steps carefully. The air around us seemed to hum with energy, and the shadows on the walls danced as if they were alive. I spoke to her gently, explaining that I understood her pain and that I was there to help her find peace. I told her about my research, her life, and the injustices she had suffered. As I spoke, the ghostly woman's form began to change. Her features softened, the sorrow in her eyes easing slightly. She looked at me with hope and relief, as if she could finally see the light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. The shadows in the room seemed to retreat, and the coldness that had gripped the house started to dissipate. With the final words of the ritual, I reached out and gently touched the mirror, which was supposed to serve as a portal to the other side. I felt a warmth spread through the room, a sign that the spirit was beginning to move on. The woman's form became less defined, her presence more ethereal as she slowly faded. The temperature returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling over the house lifted. I could still feel a lingering sadness, but it was different now. Less about the haunting presence and more about the relief of having helped someone find their way. I sat in the quiet house, reflecting on the experience. The farmhouse was still old and creaky, but it no longer felt like a place of torment. The past week's events left me shaken but also profoundly moved. I had faced the unknown and emerged with a sense of closure, both for myself and the spirit trapped here for so long. As I packed up the items from the ritual, I couldn't help but feel a sense of lingering unease. The house was no longer haunted, but the memory of what had happened would stay with me. I had done what I could to help, but the shadows of the past were never truly gone. They were waiting for the next chapter to unfold. With one last look at the now quiet farmhouse, I knew that although I had brought peace to one troubled spirit, the house would always carry the echoes of its past. I left, hoping that the next occupants would find comfort in the same way I had found resolution.